Not many weeks ago, the streets of London and many of our cities were filled with tractors and angry farmers. They were protesting at a proposed change to the rules of inheritance tax in relation to farming land. And they gained a lot of support from townspeople who might struggle to know one end of a cow from the other. Because there is something deep in our psyche from centuries back which holds fast to the ideal of a family throughout its generations farming their own plot of land, feeding themselves and others. In reality, that ideal is less common now than it used to be. Many farmers are tenant farmers, farming land which belongs to others and paying rent. And some farms may be managed by people employed for the purpose by landowners who have enough money to acquire the land, but not the ability or the desire to farm it themselves. This ideal was, however, alive and well in ancient Israel. They believed God had given them the land. And that meant not just that he had given the territory of Canaan to the people of Israel, but also that he had given each tribe, each clan, and each family their own plot of land, and it could not be taken from them. But what happened when a family fell on hard times and got into debt, and they had to sell their land or forfeit the land to pay the debt? Then they might become slaves of the person to whom they owed the debt. But Israel as a whole were once slaves in Egypt and never forgot this. They could not let their people remain slaves forever, and they could not allow people to be alienated from their land long term. So the law provided for a year of Jubilee, in which all slaves would be freed and land would be returned to its original owners. It is likely that this ideal situation fell somewhat into abeyance during Israel's experience as a nation, and was completely destroyed when the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel and the Babylonians conquered the southern kingdom of Judah, taking thousands of local residents into captivity and replacing them with people from elsewhere. But after many of the captives had returned to Judah, they continued to dream of a jubilee to end all jubilees, when slaves would be freed and everyone would have their own plot of land, even those who had no clear idea where that plot of land might be. This was the hope that was firing the prophet who wrote Isaiah chapter 61. And it was this idea to which Jesus appeals in his sermon at Nazareth. Jesus makes 3 points. Firstly, he says, he proclaims the good news to the poor. The Jubilee was good news to people who had fallen on hard times and had to sell their land, and even themselves, into slavery, because they would receive their land and freedom back again. But the prophet and Jesus were speaking to people living in a society where the Jubilee system had been broken, and much of the land was in the hands of others, never to return. However, people had not lost hope that God was going to step in, transform this wicked world and bring in his new order. The poor were not just those who had no money, but all of God's people who were longing to see him ruling in the world and in their lives. And Jesus was bringing good news. God's rule was starting to come in right now in what Jesus was saying and doing. Firstly, he comes to bring good news to the poor. Secondly, he proclaims freedom for the prisoners and those oppressed. God's people in the prophet's time, and many of Jesus' hearers too, felt themselves to be oppressed by the foreign forces controlling their land, whether that be Babylonians, Persians, Greeks or Romans. And they saw themselves as being held prisoner, even though many people in the Roman Empire at least were jealous of the special privileges the Jews had with regard to their worship. But not having complete sovereignty in their own land was intolerable for those who believed they were God's special people. In addition, many Jews in Jesus' time saw their oppressors as agents of Satan and the spiritual forces of evil. So the oppression was a spiritual oppression as well as a physical one. And they were in captivity to the forces of evil as much as to Rome. Jesus comes to set free all who believe in him from all that holds them captive, in the physical or in the spiritual world. People of that time tended to regard what we call mental illness as spiritual oppression. And while we may not agree with that way of thinking, it is likely that in promising freedom from spiritual oppression, Jesus was also proclaiming freedom from all fears, trauma, bad memories, and feelings of inferiority that imprison and oppress our souls. Firstly, Jesus came to proclaim good news to the poor. Secondly, he came to proclaim freedom to prisoners and those who are oppressed. Thirdly, he proclaims sight for the blind. All the Gospels tell us about Jesus healing blind people. It's not just that Jesus cares about people's eyesight, though he does. The message the Gospels and Jesus are trying to get across is that Jesus has come to open the eyes of our souls and minds to the truth about God. People of all ages have been blind to the truth about God. Even some of the most religious and committed people of Jesus' day were blind to the truth about God when Jesus revealed it, and they refused to accept his revelation. And if they could not see the truth about God when it stood before them literally in flesh and blood, how can we be sure people today, even people who claim to be Christians, always see God's truth as clearly as they might? We need to open ourselves up to Jesus, to receive his teaching and revelation. Jesus' congregation at Nazareth did not do that, and they tried to kill him. Jesus eventually died for those who rejected him, like Saul of Tarsus, who later became St. Paul. And he rose again that they may eventually believe. May we not delay. but open our hearts to Jesus, accept his teaching, and live life his way, so his kingdom may come in us. Amen.